So which bioforms does the Hive Mind need to go back to the drawing board for? Or which ones do Games Workshop need to give a helping hand in terms of points to? Let's talk about the weakest Tyranid units in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids once more, and in this video I thought we'd talk about the bugs, bioforms and living weapons that are maybe struggling a bit more than others in the current edition of the game. I feel like 10th edition in general has usually done a fairly good job of keeping most units and most indexes at least kind of interesting, perhaps a little bit more so than 9th edition and before. Often I feel like you might have units that's just got flatly outcompeted in terms of raw damage and defense, and Games Workshop had to be ridiculously careful with their stats in terms of damage and things to try and differentiate them. In 10th edition though, where everything gets a special rule of its own, that maybe helps at least a few of the struggling units compete a little bit more just because you might want them for their special rule, or they might add a bit to their army even if you don't want loads of them. Though still there's probably some things that really fall through the cracks, and there definitely are a few underwhelming things for the Tyranids. For this video I thought we'd talk through a few units that are either just a bit overcosted or overshadowed by other units, though fingers crossed with balance updates on the way in terms of points and a new Tyranid codex not really that far away either. Hopefully it won't stay this way for long. First up, I thought I'd get perhaps the most obvious one out of the way, which is Spore Mines and the Mucilid Spore. Though weirdly for Spore Mines, they're arguably both one of the least strong, and also the way that Tyranids are actually winning loads of games right now, so I guess it's a bit give and take there. The one that I think is actually genuinely quite weak though is the actual Spore Mines datasheet that you buy in. Paying 50 points for 3 of these living mines just really isn't the best idea in 40k right now, and you have to pay a princely 100 points for 6 of them. I feel like along with Tau drones, these might well be in the running for one of the single most overcosted units on all of Warhammer 40k, though I guess there's perhaps at least a decent chance it might just be by design. Games Workshop don't really want you buying these in just for the models that you get, and they more just want them to have a datasheet in the codex that you can spawn out of other units, as opposed to them being any sort of competitive staple to have entire units of these things drifting down from the sky. In any case, the Spore Mines, once they're down, can be kind of useful on the board for controlling the game a little bit. They are a unit that's going to be able to do things like screen deep strike, and they can do secondary objectives kind of importantly, and small nuisance units can be good for that, but if you actually bind them in, you may as well go for Rippers or something, or perhaps something else cheap like the Pyrovore. Their interesting special rule is they prevent enemy units advancing within 6 inches, and that is kind of handy as a debuff. If you have them right in the midfield right from the very start of the game, it does mean that you might be able to hamper the enemy's advance up onto the midfield objectives, but generally again you're only going to get them there if you're firing them out of biovores, essentially for free or included in their points cost. I think perhaps the most sad thing about Spore Mines though is they just have a ridiculously tiny damage output. If they even explode, which they might not because they could just get killed first, most enemies will only take 1 mortal wound to each of them, which is kind of hilariously bad for around about 17 points per model effectively. It just means that if you have enemy units move up, then they could just happily charge these and just take all the damage from them, and they'll probably be trading up. You'll lose more mines of Spore Mines just by detonating them than the enemy is likely to lose in points for their units. As mentioned though, they are still kind of weirdly powerful for secondary objectives due to biovores, firing them into the opponent's deployment zone to get behind enemy lines, or perhaps into the corners to do objectives. They are still very good for that, so they definitely have a use. Mucilids I'd also just absolutely lump into the same category at 45 points. Technically maybe a little bit of extra defense, but can get killed by say 1 anti-tank shot, which the regular Spore Mines can't. Their toughness 4 and 3 wounds, and they have D3 mortal wounds rather than 1 when you charge them, which is actually probably less mortal wounds on average for the cost. Next up, for another unit that perhaps flew a little bit too close to the sun in 9th edition, was the Harpy. He did get brought down kind of spectacularly back then, and things really don't seem to be turning around for it in 10th edition at all. It's now gone up to 230 points, up an enormous increase of 60 from 170 when the edition dropped. Again, presumably that's to punish it for being able to spawn annoying units of Spore Mines, even though again it's far worse at doing so compared with the Biovore. I think even before those changes though, most Tyranid players would have considered this one pretty far down the pecking order of bugs that you want in your army. It's only got toughness 9, a 3+ save and 12 wounds, which is pretty bad defense for 170 points, never mind 230 unless it's just going to be ludicrously destructive, and unfortunately it backs that up with its range damage output being fairly awful. This one's really one of the models that got the rough end of the Twin Links rule, and kind of lost a whole load of damage due to that. With the Stranglethorns, which do hit on 2s, you average around about 1 or 2 dead Space Marines, and with the heavy venom cannon you've got around about a 50% chance at a damage 3 shot going through against most vehicles with a 3+ save. Neither of those are really any good for the points cost. The mortal wound bomb is still at least fairly interesting. 4 mortal wounds if you moved over a unit, though you've either got the choice of only moving 20 inches now, or staying off the board and not really be able to bomb anything until turn 3. I feel like in general what would probably happen with this guy is that you move him up the board quite quickly to bomb a unit. Maybe he manages to mortal wound bomb something if he can get lucky and there's something in range, but then quite likely gets slapped back down by the enemy army quite quickly due to having such a weak defensive profile for his cost. The Hive Guard I think is fairly underwhelming as well, maybe to a slightly lesser extent though, not having taken the enormous points nerf. Another unit I'd consider pretty underwhelming for the points cost at the moment is the Winged Prime. Maybe not quite as unplayable as Spore Mines, just a bit meh for the points. Could be interesting enough to help out gargoyles bully other scoring units a little bit, but I feel like just in general people are really quite down on this guy and kind of underwhelmed for what he brings to the table. First up, he's an 80-point character that can join either gargoyles or warriors, though just intrinsically neither of those feel like amazing choices for him. The gargoyles don't really want to be in combat that much and don't really have damage that's that worth buffing. And while the warriors are at least aiming to be a bit more on the battle line, they're not really all that efficient, and also they don't have wings as well, so it means that his extra movement is a little bit wasted, even if he might help out with charges a bit I suppose. You could jump him to the front of a unit and shorten the charge distance. His main boost to the damage is granting the unit sustained hits 1, kind of meaningful on bigger warrior units to get a bit more damage out of them, though I'd say a lot less so on gargoyles, seeing as they're not really the best damage dealers in the first place. And also on top of that, the Tyranids core rules from the invasion swarm. That's already going to give you sustained hits 1 in at least a few matchups when you're fighting mainly infantry, so it might mean that his core boost is just entirely useless in those games, at least with Tyranids the way they are at present. Then I feel like the thing that people really weren't the most keen on was that his melee damage just feels a bit sad for the cost. He does get 6 attacks, which is fairly respectable, but they're at strength 6, AP minus 1 and damage 2, seemingly really quite a common profile for Tyranids, not terrible at killing individual 2-wound Space Marines, but a bit underwhelming against virtually anything else. With his own sustained hits, he averages around about 2 dead Space Marines with average rolling, which isn't terrible, though I feel like that is kind of his ideal target. Perhaps one of the slightly disappointing things is that he's just not quite odds on to kill a single Terminator in a round of combat, despite him having that rather epic starring role tearing apart the Assault Cannon Terminator in the animated trailer for 10th. I think in reality he isn't really all that far away from where he needed to be, maybe just one further buff like devastating wounds or AP minus 2 or 7 attacks might have just made him that bit more appealing, but I still feel like he's that level where you don't really want to pay 80 points for that sort of damage profile. Otherwise, he does provide synapse, which is handy enough for gargoyles winging around I suppose, and if the enemy wipes them out in combat he will fight in death, though again the damage profile's not super exciting for that. Overall, and in general, I'd not rate him as unplayable. It's probably best used with a unit of gargoyles running around and being a disruptive threat, jump shoot jumping to remain on objectives and stay safe, and then maybe pounce on lighter enemy units that you think that this guy can tear apart okay when he's backed up by a swarmy unit. Still though, even for that role I feel like he's a bit questionable. You could get an entire extra squad of gargoyles if you want for more objective disruption, and I can't help but think that's going to be the better choice most of the time. Moving on for another unit I feel like probably just doesn't really quite work at the moment are Hive Guard. These guys do have 2 decent advantages. They've got OK durability with a big toughness 7 and 3+ save. That's not bad for their points cost. And also they get the ability to hit on Overwatch on a 4+ if they're within range of an objective. It could be okay as well, but I feel like both of these are just let down so much by their damage profiles being very unexciting. They are kind of clunky infantry that aren't going to be quite as easy to bring to bear as they move quite slowly. So in general, you'd hope that they have some fairly good firepower to make up for that when they're competing with things like the Exocrine or Malaceptor with a whole load of big hitting damage 3 attacks. I feel like the 2 weapons are sort of almost where you want them to be, but really not quite as good. The Impaler Cannon is indirect fire, 4 attacks hitting on a 4+ at strength 5, AP 1 and damage 1 with the heavy keyword, though it does mean that if they are taking the indirect fire penalties, you only average around about 6 attacks on your target at strength 5 and effective AP 0 due to cover. That's an average of just a single wound to Space Marine targets, or around about 2 or 3 dead Horde infantry. Not really very exciting against those fairly optimal targets, and very bad indeed against vehicles. Even now they've got a huge increase and went up to 65 points, the Biovore still competes pretty well with that. They're solidly better against a lot of targets as well with their devastating wounds. Never mind they've got the ability to throw out those Spore Mines to win you the game on objectives as well. That leaves the Shock Cannon at 2 attacks at strength 7, AP minus 1 and damage 3 with anti-vehicle 2+, so at least it does mean that you should be getting some solid wounds on vehicles. and though it's short range, I guess the profile will be at least somewhat concerning to medium or heavy infantry as well. Again though, just feels a little bit underwhelming for the cost. The AP-1 just isn't really that great, even if they are firing against vehicles, means that they only average around about 3 wounds to a save 3+ tank in cover. Not truly dreadful for 100 points, but not particularly exciting either, particularly with the range and being more limited to one target that you want to hit. Even with the anti-vehicle, firing at a similar target, something like an Exocrine just does this far better. Plus he's got other interesting special rules, is more mobile, and is kind of equally tanky. I guess perhaps the biggest draw to them, other than the durability, is their Overwatch. They get to hit on a 4+ Overwatch if they're within range of an objective marker. I think that is strong enough to be interesting, and he could be even firing Ignores Line of Sight Overwatch with the Impaler cannons. But I still feel like the damage output is going to be kind of passable even against fairly optimal targets, and you might want to be saving your command points for a few more 5+ Feel No Pains in the enemy turn, and overwatching with a Tyrannifex with the acid spray is probably also better if you've got one of those. Finally, for the main Tyranids I consider kind of underwhelming, the Sporocyst I think is worth a mention as well. I do kind of feel like there's a bit of a theme here with Spore Mine type things that are outcompeted by Biovores perhaps. The Sporocyst is kind of a Tyranid fortification, though for some reason doesn't actually get the fortification keyword, it just gets monster and is immobile with a movement of 0. It's 145 points. I feel like perhaps the single biggest problematic thing for it is its durability. It's only toughness 10, 10 wounds and a 3+ save, which stacking up against just about any other fortification unit in the game is just very, very bad. Usually the idea behind them is that they're tough, but your opponent has the option to play around them. They might not have to deal with them immediately. A few las cannon shots directed this guy's way is going to bring it down very quickly. Otherwise, it doesn't have the ability to either forward deploy or deep strike. It could typically be kind of disruptive and set up in the midfield last edition. You could weirdly transport it with a Tyrannicide if you really wanted to, but that's probably not the most viable option anyway either, given that the Tyrannicide is kind of pricey in itself. The Sporocyst brings two main things to the table: Hive defenses for a whole bunch of bioweapon shooting plus seeding mucolids. The Hive defenses fire out 5 attacks at ballistic skill 4+, strength 5, AP-1 and damage 2. And it can fire them in your turn, but it's mainly the idea is that you'd be firing that in the enemy turn. When an enemy moves within 24 inches of it, you get to open fire on them up to 4 times per turn. That could be disruptive enough against some targets. You'd be averaging 2 or 3 of those hits on most units. Might be good to kill a Space Marine or something, or chip away at a Horde. There are going to be a huge amount of things that just don't really care too much about that profile that you're wounding on 5s and have good saves though. Say against Knights, they could probably just happily move into range of it and laugh off the damage that does little or nothing, maybe just failing 1 save or something. Otherwise, its other ability is to seed some mucolids. It gets to throw one out within 18 inches of it, and that could be useful enough for a little bit of disruption, screening, and slowing down enemy advances. Again though, this just really doesn't compare anyway at all compared with the much cheaper Biovore that can throw them out virtually over the whole board. And on top of that, you have to sacrifice your normal shooting attack for that as well, so you are losing value as well as gaining the value of the mucolid. Overall, probably needed to either be significantly tougher or significantly cheaper. Even if it was very, very tough though, I kind of feel like there'd just be a chance that people would just ignore it. It could be a bit disruptive, but I feel like it's probably unlikely to add up to 145 points worth of value. Overall, I'd say that they're probably the units that I'd rank in the top 5. I think there's definitely a lot of other things in the Tyranid Codex that people would ideally like to see some sort of points or rules buff for. Maybe these guys being some of the more notable. Tyranid Warriors I think are a bit underwhelming compared with where they were in 9th edition. Not really able to credibly carry a competitive Tyranid battle line at the moment. You're better off with monsters or zoanthropes or something. The Screamer Killer at 180 points is just a bit much for what it brings. Kind of a shame as it's a really fun model with some powerful rules and damage dealing, but it's just not worth the 180 points that you pay for it. Perhaps the same for the Toxicrin, which feels like it should be a much cheaper monster, particularly when you have things like the Harpy and Exocrine running at around 70 points less than this. Its damage profile isn't terrible, it'll certainly rip apart a bunch of infantry, but being so dedicated to killing one target that you might not always be in combat with is just a little bit unfortunate for a 200 point monster that isn't quite as tough as other things like a Tyrannifex. And otherwise, maybe I'd mention the big Forge World bogs here. In general, they often tend to be kept in a bit of a niche or peripheral role, but the Harridan and Hierophant again are a bit overcosted for what they do, even if they do have kind of immense stat lines. Let me know what you think down in the comments though. Which are the Tyranids units that you'd most like to see Games Workshop buff or get a points cut for? And would you agree that these are some of the weakest units in the index, or are you still managing to find a role for them on the battlefield at the moment? As always, look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.